All right, here we are. This is Jay Brown Yoga Talks podcast. My name is Jay Brown. Welcome to you, whoever you are. Thank you for listening. This week, we're doing a check-in episode, which means that if this is your first time here, I feel compelled to mention that it might not be the best episode to listen to first. Only because it is a bit of a departure from what the show regularly offers. I believe this is the 5th check-in episode I've done out of 430, or something. Actually, there's more than 430. I've got a few in the can. But only in the last few years have I started doing this where I just dedicate a whole episode to me talking about some things that I feel like I want to talk about. Now, I always do that. In all the episodes of this show, I do the intros and the outros. Regular listeners know from the very beginning, part of this show has always been my own personal reflections and my own personal history. I think of the show as an oral history of yoga coming to the West and becoming part of mainstream culture. And I've said it before, I feel like me coming into my adulthood has paralleled that. I started teaching yoga in my early 20s. A few weeks ago, I turned 52. And that's all I've done. I don't have any other profession. The only thing I've done in the last almost 30 years is teach yoga. And so part of the show has always been me talking about what's going on with me. And very often it connects to the conversations that I'm having with my guests, because the way that I decide which conversations to have with who is based on what's going on with me. So they do often connect. But as the years have gone on and I've matured some, I think, as a podcast host, I did start to feel like sometimes if I really just air out everything I want to talk about, the intros just get too long. Like, even if they connect to the conversation, if the intro's like 20 minutes or more before I get to my hour and 15-minute conversation, it starts to feel like it's detracting from the conversations rather than enhancing what I feel like the conversations are about. So I started making my comments more terse and just not really airing everything out, and then started to feel like, for the people who've been following me from the beginning, that there's like all this stuff that I want to talk about that really does relate to what's happening in the yoga world, because it's happening with me and I'm in the yoga world, whatever that is. So at some point I feel like there's too much to talk about in a 10 to 15 minute intro. And so just giving myself this opportunity to air it out has been my solution to that. And if you're not so interested in my thoughts and reflections, but you're more interested in the conversations that I have, please go ahead and move back in the archive or move forward, depending on when you're listening. There's all kinds of wonderful stuff there. I do already have several amazing episodes in the can that'll be coming to you. But this week, we're having a check-in. Last time we did this, it was the end of last year, so exactly 6 months ago, essentially. And the episode was entitled, Standing at a Crossroads. This episode is entitled, Keeping the Dream Alive. And before we just pick up from where I left off 6 months ago, I am actually going to take this as an opportunity to lay the whole story out from the beginning more. Like I said, I want this to be a bit of an oral history. And for me personally, I want it told in one place. Like, if you've been following along over the years, you've gotten all the pieces of what's been happening and how I've gotten to where I am. But if you're more new to the show and you haven't heard all that and you don't know me or anything about it, just telling you where we are now, I don't think as interesting or useful as knowing how we got here. And really, again, it's for me. The whole purpose of doing this show has always been for me to understand, how did I get here? So let's go back there. Let's start from the beginning. The first yoga class I ever went to was Jiva Mukti Yoga Center on 2nd Avenue. It was like 1993. And that yoga center, it was a really special place. You've heard people come on and talk about it. It became like a yoga home for me. For a good 2 years, better part of 2 years, I went to class 4 to 5 days a week, sometimes more than one class a day. And that's all I did. It was a very particular time in my life. I was living in the Lower East Side of Manhattan in an apartment on Stanton and B for $400 a month. And I had this gig being a weed delivery guy. So back then, cannabis was not legal in New York like it is now. If you go to New York City now, there's weed everywhere. But back in the early 90s, it was not so. When I was in college, I had this great weed guy that I would always get my weed from, and I turned all my friends onto him. So like whenever my friends needed weed, I was like, hey, I got the guy. And what you would do is you would call a number, and it was a guy who had a beeper. So for those of you who are from younger generations listening to this and are not familiar with the primitive technologies that some of us grew up with, before there were mobile phones, before anyone even had a cell phone, there first was beepers where you could call a number and it would beep a little device that someone had on their hip, and it would have your number, and then you would call that number back. So you would call the guy who had the beeper, and he would come over with the weed. And so when I graduated college and decided I didn't want to be an actor and didn't know what I wanted to do, and just yoga became my thing, and I was just going to classes every day at Jiva Mukti, at that time, my weed guy was like, hey, I don't want to keep doing this all the time. Do you want to work together? You can deliver, and I'll just take care of everything else. So I didn't have to put up any money. I didn't have to do anything. All I did was deliver weed to all of my college friends because they were all still going to him. So I had graduated, and I had this gig where I was making so much more money than I needed. I could go deliver weed for 1 or 2 days and have my rent and expenses paid for the month. And all I did was go to yoga classes. And after about 2 years of that, of just practicing and studying yoga exclusively, that's all I did. And it should be said that I would say a pretty huge transformation happened to me in that 2-year period where all I did was practice and study yoga. People who knew me saw that happen. All my friends, a lot of those friends who I was like delivering weed to, they all saw a change in me and all ended up practicing yoga before long, some of them with me. And eventually I started teaching. I'll never forget the day I was at a class at Jiva Mukti. At that time, I was a figure in classes because I went all the time. Teachers would ask me to do demonstrations and stuff. I had taught a couple of private yoga classes. I had some friends who wanted to do yoga with me, and I had done like a couple of privates with a friend or two, but that's the only teaching I had, and I certainly wasn't like telling anybody I was a yoga teacher. But it was after a class that the teacher had asked me to do this big demonstration, and after the class, I was getting dressed, and someone came up to me, Hannah. Her name was Hannah, and she said, "Hey, we've never met before, but I have this yoga class at a YMCA that I can't keep doing, and I'm wondering if you want it." And without really thinking about it, I just said, yes. And so I took that class, and that became the first yoga class that I ever taught. And then I did end up doing a teacher training with one of my teachers. We've talked about this on the show a bunch of times. After a couple years at Jiva Mukti, they started to standardize their method and offer teacher training. And some of the teachers I was into, who were like my teachers that I always went to, kind of branched off and went to different places. And I studied with Allison West for a couple of years after that. And that's right when the Yoga Alliance announced its 200-hour standards and everybody started creating teacher training programs. I did do one, I believe, with Allison in 1997. And at that point is when I started just telling people I was a yoga teacher, and yoga completely exploded in New York City. And when I say exploded, I'm not being hyperbolic. It was crazy. I actually found one of my palm cards from those earlier years when all these yoga centers started opening up and people were really starting to get into yoga, and there was all this private yoga students. I never taught more yoga classes that period. I found one of my palm cards that I would make that said Yoga with Jay Brown, and it just listed all of the classes I was teaching at all the different centers I was at that time. And I was shocked. I didn't even really remember, but I had 15 scheduled classes across 5 different yoga centers. And that didn't even include the 5 or so privates I was doing every week. I was teaching 20 classes a week, sometimes up to 22, depending, because I could fit a couple more in if I had to. For years, 20 classes a week for I'd say a good 4 or 5 years, I maintained that schedule. It's all I did. And eventually I let go of doing the weed delivery, and I was just teaching yoga. And I wonder right now, how many people listening to this right now are teaching 20 yoga classes a week? Does that even happen anymore? I imagine it does somewhere, but probably not that much. And at some point, I do remember I reduced that. I reduced it down to maybe 12 scheduled classes across 4 centers. And sometimes you would do the back-to-backs where you would do the 10 and the 12 because you had to travel everywhere. So it was good for the teacher to do a back-to-back, and sometimes good for the center because you could fill up the schedule with more classes. So I would get it down to 12 and then 2 or 3 privates a week because I had more opportunities than I could take, and I was able to pick and choose more where I wanted to teach and who I wanted to work with. At some point, I think this happened to a lot of people. If you did that for years, and I maintained that for, again, maybe 5 to 7 years, where I just kind of cruised there. And eventually, at more than one center, I was considered a senior teacher. All of my classes were filled. I had full classes. And you start running numbers in your head. Because originally, the center brought the people in. That was always the deal that you had between the teacher and the center. The center brought the people in, and the teacher kept the people coming. And it worked for a good while, except at some point, it started to become more about the teacher than the center. And that parallels with the whole kind of creation of yoga celebrity and the industry kind of booming, and there being these Yoga Journal magazine covers and, all the stuff we've talked about the conferences and the industry kind of growing, and they're becoming this yoga celebrity. And at some point, even it changed it in terms of the marketing. We've talked about this as well. You had John Friend created Anusara Yoga. People were creating a yoga brand or a yoga school or system. And then at some point, that fell out of favor and it became about the teacher. If John Friend had been in my generation and someone had come before him and all the same shit had happened, it wouldn't have been Anusara Yoga. It would have been John Friend Yoga. It became about the teacher. And that is also because as classes became more popular and part of people's regular lives, they were choosing teachers. So it's common that you identify with a particular teacher, you connect with that teacher, and then you make their class your thing. So it might have been that the center is really conveniently located and right around the corner from your house originally is why you went in there, but it's the teacher that you've connected with and you prefer to go to that teacher's class than other teachers. Hopefully the center's really great and there's lots of teachers there that you love and it doesn't matter. But at that time, particularly also because that was part of like coming out of the guru-disciple relationship and, you know, you're a charismatic teacher and you making a connection to them. So it still was very rooted in that idea or that relationship. So at some point, it wasn't the center that was driving all of the attendance. It was the teachers. And you would run the numbers. You would see there's 40 people in class. They're all paying somewhere between $12 and $15 or whatever it was at that time per class, depending on their class packs. There was no memberships, just class packs. And you could figure it out and you'd be like, wow, this is what I get paid and this is what this class is bringing in. And you knew how much money that class was bringing in and how much you were getting of it. And at a certain point, it didn't feel like a fair balance anymore. And the teacher would strike out on their own and they'd open their own place. And I had seen teachers do that before me. And I, in turn, followed in their footsteps and did the same thing. So after 10 years of being an independent yoga teacher, teaching at all kinds of different places, I opened my own place. And it should be mentioned that it was about opening a place for me to teach where I could feel free to really teach in the way that I wanted to without feeling like I was always coming up against these expectations. Because, as we've also discussed on this show, the trends in yoga all went to power vinyasa, and I went towards a slow, gentle flow. You know, back before they called it slow, gentle flow, I was doing this softer, simpler practice inspired by TKV Desikachar teachings that I was trying to bring into my group vinyasa yoga classes. So I was really going in a different direction than what had become popular. And even though my classes were well received, they often felt in some conflict or at odds with a lot of the other classes happening at the center. And I also was younger and immature and like saying stupid shit in my classes and like creating adversarial dynamics and relationships between what I was doing and what everybody else was doing because I needed to, you know, bolster myself so I could feel confident in going against the grain, I think. But that's a whole other podcast, maybe. In any case, I broke out on my own. And the only reason that happened was because of, I believe, a divine intervention where I had been walking down the streets of Brooklyn, New York, corner of Lorimer and Metropolitan. There was a storefront, this big open storefront, and I thought it was just on the other side of the BQE, and it was before the gentrification had gotten there. And I thought, this is it. This is far enough away from the other yoga center where that yoga center owner, I don't think she'll be mad at me. And I think this is where I could do it. It was right next to the subway stop. And before I even inquired into the space, I realized that the only way that I could do it was if I could somehow get my hands on a chunk of money that I didn't have. Like at that point, I was no longer making way more than I needed delivering weed. I was making a living off teaching, and I was making enough to pay for everything, but it wasn't that much. I mean, I did actually, if I think about it, what happened was I saved up money for a bunch of years and then I spent it all on a trip to India in 1998, which I've talked about. So I saved up this money teaching and I went to India and then I came back. And at that point, I was making enough to pay for everything, but it wasn't like I was putting a lot of money away. And I certainly didn't have money to like do everything that you need to do to start a center based on what needed to happen with the space. And really just to feel confident that I could like take on a lease with this like rent and not know how I was going to make enough money to pay for that. So in any case, I actually did do a transition where I kind of still had some classes at some place after I first opened. It was a little bit sticky, but eventually what happened was I was online, which is ironic. And I came across this thing called an SBA Express loan. It was like this special loan for people who had really good credit scores, but no assets. And that was me. And longer story short, this one woman, an angel, just decided to help me and nursed me through this process. And I got this chunk of money, $15,000 in 2007, specifically to open a yoga center. I had to make a business plan and projections and all this stuff, which all ended up not being accurate, but it looked really good on paper, and they gave me the loan. And I went to inquire into the space, and I met the landlord, and everything, all these green lights came together, and suddenly I found myself with this storefront in Williamsburg, Brooklyn. And I made a space that I wanted to teach in, so that when I walked in there, it felt the way that I thought it should feel, that felt the best to me, that was the most conducive to what I wanted to do and share in yoga. And for the first 5-6 years at least, it was golden. It was golden. It grew and people came, and it was really a very special place. And it made me love being a yoga teacher, and I formed deep, profound relationships to people who I still have to this day. I recently learned, which we'll get to. But in any case, I had this really golden period of time where I created a space for yoga, and I hired teachers, and we grew it, and it had, 20 teachers on the staff, and 40 something classes a week, full schedule, and it hummed, and it was beautiful. And I never paid attention really that much to the money. I'm going to be honest. I had no spreadsheet. I basically was just banking on the fact that more money was coming in than was going out. And that was the case. And it worked. It didn't start to not work until after that first lease renewal, which we've talked about. The lease renewals, you get like a 30% bump up, and you maybe raise your cost of a class $1 per person, but that also paralleled with the growing saturation, more and more yoga centers, and the advent of venture capital backed yoga center chains that were spreading across the country. YogaWorks coming in and buying up 4 independent centers and setting up YogaWorks north, south, east, and west in Manhattan. Like, you at some point were kind of competing with a different kind of yoga center. It wasn't just a yoga teacher who got a lease like me because they'd been teaching for 10 years and they wanted to make a place for yoga. You had people owning yoga centers who weren't yoga teachers. You had corporations owning yoga centers. And that's when everything switched over to the membership models. It wasn't independent yoga teachers who decided it would be a good idea to operate more like gyms and have memberships. It was business folks who weren't yoga teachers trying to have a soul journey. And so all of the independent teachers did end up having to try to compete on those terms. I did. I remember when stuff started to go south, that was when I was like, holy crap, I got to do online registration, and I got to, shorten the classes. All the classes got shorter. Like, all these things happened that the independent centers had to sort of go along with, and still made wonderful places and worked within those. But what was steering it were these market forces, not so much just yoga teachers coming out of their yoga practice trying to do a thing like I was. And eventually, as we've discussed, it just is unsustainable. You can't keep it going. The overheads get to be too much. And at that time, the attendance went down. And that's what was happening in 2015, late 2015, when I started this show. I started doing this show, and everything was sort of in a collapse at that point. And I knew that the center wasn't going to be able to continue, and I didn't know what I was going to do. And I was like using these long intros in the show. I'll never forget this one intro I did before Judith Hansen Lassiter. The first time I ever had the famed Judith Hansen Lassiter on the show. I spent like 25 minutes crying about what's going But it's what was what happening. And so the end of the center plays out at the very beginning of this show. If you want to go back and listen to the early episodes, it's when the center closed, and the podcast did kind of take off some. It became a thing before I was completely done with the center. And I should mention that previous to the podcast, I had my blog, which certainly had made my name out there more than other teachers, because I had been very active online, and people had shared when the beginning of Facebook happened, before it turned ugly, before there was all the other ones, before there was Instagram and Twitter, but there was this thriving blogosphere. We've talked about that. So I had a bit of a reputation, even though I didn't have like the celebrity of like a Sean Korn or even like a Jason Crandall, because I'd never been on a yoga journal cover or been at a conference really. I just had some like, I don't know, street cred. I was like a B-lister. And so as the center was closing and the podcast started to take off, I did have opportunities to get on the international travel circuit and had people wanting me to come. They'd heard of the podcast and they're like, come teach in all these different countries. And so I had a couple of years there, 2017 to 2019, where that's what I did. And, it did manage to replace whatever amount of income I was making from my in-person teaching when I was at the center. So my in-person teaching money went from in-person teaching, having the center, to travel. And there was the introduction of the internet stuff. Like I went online at that time when I let go of the center too. So I did start to have some amount. And, in 2019, it was probably like 60% in-person, 40% internet, although it was trending more towards 50-50. But I will say at that time, you could see that there were obvious patterns and trends in the yoga markets. Like what happened in New York hadn't happened yet in Australia or China, but you could see similar trajectories of how the teacher training numbers were down and the workshop numbers were down, and the kind of boom seemed to have boomed, and now things seem to be on a more downward trajectory. And a lot of us were observing that and talking about that. And I was trying to come up with my living room tours, if you remember. And we were really noticing like, oh, this travel circuit and the yoga centers and all the teacher trainings, it doesn't seem like it's going to work anymore. And at that time, I had really let go of any idea that you needed a yoga center. Like I started to really feel that the space didn't matter, that we just need to go back to the old days before people opened yoga centers and they taught in their living rooms and they taught in church basements, and let's get away from these spa environments and, all this like yoga center hubbub that's not about practice. It's just about teacher-student relationship and doing practice and people being in their lives. The space doesn't matter. I'll just rent spaces off of Airbnb and host my workshops there. I don't need a yoga center. I let go of the idea that yoga centers were even necessary anymore. And frankly, a lot of the yoga centers that are still around were doing fitness stuff because that's what sells better. We've talked about that too. Like the challenges of having a yoga center just are sometimes too much to really make it viable, it seemed to me. And I just let go of that as a possibility. Then, of course, we all know what happens. The world falls apart. Everything goes online. I'm already set up, so it's easy for me to go online. And there's all the pandemic assistance money for the first year. And then the second year, you have a good year online. I know I'm not the only one. We all had at least one good year online. If you got on quick and you had a little bit of a thing going and you got some folks who wanted to practice with you online, some of us, I think a good amount of us who did that, had at least one good solid year, maybe two, 1.5 maybe, where you made enough money online because everybody did everything online. And for a second, some of us thought, wow, can I actually make my living online? However, we all know that there's been a kind of backlash, I think, to everything going online, and people are doing less online, and I don't blame them. I'm doing less online too, except teaching. I'm still teaching all my classes online, but in terms of all the stuff that I was doing personally, I get it. There's good reasons for that. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying there's still not fantastic things happening online. I'm just saying that there's been a backlash to everything going online. And that's kind of where I was at the end of last year. You see, at the end of last year, everything had taken this big downturn and I didn't know what to do. That was the crossroads. It was like, oh, wow, is this whole gig of being a yoga teacher done? And I thought at the time, I was like, I need to get back into the room with people right here in my neighborhood, just like when I started. So I have a space that I share with a photographer here in my neighborhood. I started sharing that space during the pandemic. When I first got to, I guess this is part of the story too, when I first got here, after having this center, I just got teaching jobs at all these different centers. I went back to doing what I had done with my palm card, and I got classes at 3 different yoga centers in the area, and I taught, maybe 6 classes a week across 3 different centers for about a year and a half before it felt like it wasn't the right thing to do. That by that time, I completely solidified myself as this like gentle, slow yoga teacher. All the yoga centers were doing the power vinyasa, and while there'd be like a couple of people who were into what I was doing, I'd get my like 2 or 3 regulars who were like, yeah, you're my guy. My classes were never as well attended as other classes, and they weren't so sustainable. If you only have 2 or 3 at the center these days, it's not going to last. And so eventually I got my own space in Allentown, which is about a half hour from where I live. I got this beautiful space. I'm like, oh, this is so beautiful. Unfortunately, the reason it was so inexpensive was that it was in a neighborhood that no one was going to go to. And I didn't really think about that because I thought it's all about the teacher and people will drive 20 or 30 minutes to get to me because they've connected with me. But it didn't work really because the people in that neighborhood right there weren't coming to yoga classes, and the people I imagined were going to drive weren't because a lot of people aren't going to drive 30 minutes for an hour yoga class, that they're going to go to the center right around their corner. So eventually during the pandemic, everything was falling apart and the landlords at that space were horrible. So I let go of that and I moved into this space share here in my neighborhood where this photographer is only in the space like 2 days a week. So she agreed to let me have it the other 5 days a week. And I've been doing everything out of there. And I set it up as a like virtual studio. So it's really set up for online production. I really wasn't imagining any in-person students there. Eventually, I did want to try to get some in-person students in as we came out of the pandemic and people were doing that more. And I did kind of make it so that was the case. But the space is really not that great. It's on the 2nd floor and no one knows it's there necessarily, just only me emailing people. And really the space never had a good feel. Frankly, the photographer does boudoir photography. So it just, it just as a side note, like the energy of the space never felt that great. Even though I would have good classes there and people came, people were not coming for the space. That's my point. They were only coming because they wanted to practice with me. And the real thing that happened, and this is what I talked about in December, was I decided that I wanted to try and get people from my neighborhood into my classes. Like I need to have real people show up where I live, just like when I started, so that I can feel inspired in all the online stuff I'm doing. And so I got an A-frame sign and I put it outside, and within a day, people started coming in. And I was super excited, like, oh my God, this is going to work. And then if you're a regular listener, you'll remember this. Then I found out that the space that I was in was not zoned as a commercial space. And the husband of the photographer who owns the building called me in a panic, telling me that I can't have that sign out there, that the code inspectors are going to come, and he was kicking me out essentially. So I talked him down off the ledge, said, I'm sorry, I had no idea, but basically I can't advertise it as like a space. Like I got to do it on the down low. And when that happened, I felt like, oh crap, what do I do? And I went and I looked to see, are there other spaces here in my neighborhood? And there are none. Like there's no, I talked about this in the check-in, how there's this one space, a restaurant space that's been empty forever, and how I kind of knew a guy who knew the guy who owned that. And I had been trying to like get in touch with them. And I was hoping that maybe there was a chance I could get into the room with this guy and I will do the song and dance. I remember saying, I'll do the dance if you get me in the room with the guy, so I could have a space to try to create something again, like I did back in 2007. And frankly, for the first couple months, in January and February, I kept texting the guy to see if we could make it happen, to go have drinks with the guy. It just didn't happen. It just didn't happen. So I stopped trying. At a certain point, I stopped trying. And I really just felt lost. I just did not know what to do. And if you recall, I had an episode with Noah Mazet where he was writing emails that sounded like the way I felt at that time, where I just didn't know what I was going to do. Like in February of this year into March, I would say, or even later, I really didn't know what I was going to do. And then about a month ago, maybe a little bit longer, 6 weeks ago, I was in my teacher's Sangha, my weekly teacher's Sangha. I do a weekly Zoom meeting that I've been doing since 2018, I think. Wow. And the people in that meeting they're my friends. They know me because we just go to this Zoom meeting every week and like talk about what feels important to us. Sometimes we talk about the podcast, but sometimes we just talk about whatever. And I was in this meeting and I was saying something out loud to other people that I hadn't said out loud, that if I needed to stop being a yoga teacher, then I was okay with it. That it was getting to a point where I really have to face the possibility that maybe this is done and maybe I need to do something else. I would have never imagined that at age 52, I was going to have a career change. I have no idea what that would be. But I've always said that if teaching yoga isn't working, then I'll just do something else, that I can't cling to it as an identity or a profession. That it's always been about what feels like authentic and real to me about yoga and practice and sharing in that. And everything else has been a byproduct of that. And I was very like raw and emotional in the meeting, and it felt hard to say, but I needed to say it. And then, the people in the meeting are my friends and like supporting me and, encouraging me. And you see, what I didn't know was that at that exact moment, and I do believe it was at the exact moment, a text landed into my phone. And I only knew that because when I got off the meeting and I picked up my phone, I saw it. And when I went back, because the call was recorded, I went back to what time it was in the meeting when I said that to people. And in the moment that I had said that is the exact moment that the text came in. And the text was from my friend who knows the guy, and it said, "Hey, I'm here with the guy. He says he's into the idea. Give him a ring tomorrow. Here's his number." And I just remember the moment when that happened. Like I just got so emotional. It was like unbelievable. Like, y'all have heard me talking about praying. That's what I've been doing. Praying really hard. Asking for guidance on what I should do. And all of a sudden, this text shows up out of nowhere. So I call the guy. Some of you have heard me talking about this more recently. The space is it's small, but the rent's low enough. And it's like the perfect location. It's a location that you'll never find. Like, there's literally 3 blocks in my neighborhood that are commercially zoned. You never get a chance to rent them. They're never available. There's never a for rent sign. There's never a listing online. You just have to know the guy, you know? There was a dentist in this space for 30 plus years who passed away, I think, or retired. I don't know. But that's the only reason. And it fell out of the sky. Okay. But here's the problem. I'm in the exact same place I was in 2007, where, like, financially, I don't have any money to open a yoga center, even a small place, even if I don't have to put money into the space and it's already ready, which is the case because the landlord agreed to fix the space up and make it work for me. I don't even have to pay for it. That's a whole other story of how things are going with the landlord, but kind of good. Like, the landlord is what I would want from a landlord, it seems. But in any case, I'm faced with this moment, okay, where I'm texting with the landlord. I go see the space. I think, oh shit, this could potentially work. I basically send him my needs. I was like, if I was going to take this space, this is what I need. And he comes back with basically almost all of them. And is like, if you want it, it's yours. And like, I basically have to decide right then. I mean, I had like a little time to decide, but not really. And honestly, it didn't take me that long, because as I sat there contemplating it and feeling it, like, and just sort of trying on both possibilities. One possibility was I say yes, not having any money to do it, and really potentially putting myself in a very bad financial situation. Like, I've got 2 kids. I'm barely making the payments on things and kind of keeping my head above water, and things have changed so drastically, and my own business relationships are changing. There's all kinds of stuff happening, and I'm just, it's certainly not the right time to take on more risk, you know? But when I put on the other hat, when I put on the hat saying, sorry, I can't do it, and then looking at what's there for me, it was so crushing. It was so crushing. I just wept, and I felt, I can't not do this. I have to try. I have to try one more time. If it doesn't work, and after a year, I'm fucked and I have more debt. Okay, at least I tried. You know, at least I tried, and I proved it to myself. The yoga centers are not viable, and you can't do it anymore. And maybe I got to do something else. Okay, I can accept it then. But to say no to this like opportunity that sort of came from God, to not try, just felt like so wrong on every level. Like, I have to try. So I just said, yes, I'll take it. And then now here I am. I'm fucked. Not fucked, but I'm psyched. I'm filled with hope again. Like, I'm like, wow. And suddenly I'm imagining like what I could do and like what's possible, and feeling all the same feelings I felt back when I opened the center before, and all the reasons why I love being a yoga teacher, and how important it feels to do it right now, to try right now. Everybody's over being online. And there's people, I'm the neighborhood association vice president. I know people in the neighborhood. It's like too many green lights not to try. And there's this one obstacle. I got no money, you know? And I reached out to like the couple of people who might be able to help me. And, you know, I didn't know, there was nothing else to do. So I did what I always used to do back in the day, before I had this podcast, when I needed to work through what was happening with me and what to do, like what I needed to say right now. I wrote a blog post. And I sent it to my email list a week ago. Basically, in the blog post, and I'm going to read it. I'm going to read it to you, but the blog post basically condenses a lot of what I just said down to its like, I think, most important points, and then basically asks for help. And I mean, the response has been pretty amazing. I gotta say, pretty wild. So listen, I think what I'm gonna do at this point, I don't even know how long I've been going for. I'm not going to look. I'm just going to read the blog posts, and then I think I might call it quits. But let's read it. I think it's interesting. Maybe some of you don't know this. I do have another podcast called J Brown Yoga Thoughts. There's usually a link in the description. I don't know if I'm going to put it in this one, but in all the other episodes, there's a link to this other podcast that I do, which is me recording my blog posts. And I've gotten back into doing it. I've been doing it for some months. I stopped doing it for a while, but I've been doing it again. And it is very different. It's not a long, unscripted conversation between someone else and me. It's me trying to write 800 to 1,000 words that in some way encapsulates what's going on with me and is interesting enough that it would be worthwhile for someone to read it. And so I think it's interesting to kind of maybe hear the difference between me just talking, rambling like I have, and then me trying to write it out. So the post is entitled, Keeping the Dream Alive. I've never been very good at asking for help, probably because at a formative time in my life when I needed it, there was none to be had. That experience conditioned me to stop asking altogether. I determined that I couldn't rely on anyone else, so I convinced myself that I didn't need anything from anyone. In some ways, that has served me well. But inevitably, there comes a time when it becomes clear that everyone needs help sometimes. And I find myself at one of these moments. You see, I'm trying to open a small yoga center in my neighborhood of Easton, Pennsylvania. But the last few years have been so difficult financially that I'm lacking the necessary seed money to make a decent go of it. The only reason I'm even considering doing such a crazy thing is because a unicorn of a space has unexpectedly presented itself, and for the first time in quite a while, I feel a glimmer of possibility and hope. I live in a square-mile neighborhood called College Hill. There are literally 3 blocks of commercially zoned space that is either owned by Lafayette College or a few old-school families that grew up here and have held out. I have been entertaining what it would be like to try and have a place on the hill since I moved here in 2017, but ultimately determined that it was basically impossible. I have walked these 3 blocks countless times, but have never seen a space with a for rent sign, much less a listing online. You basically have to know the right person and get lucky, on the off chance that one ever even becomes available. To make a much longer story shorter, I happened to meet a guy who knew the guy, and I got a call. There's a space that has been occupied by a dentist for 30 plus years and is now available. It's super small. It will only fit like 7 to 8 people max per class. But the rent is low enough that I think it could work. When I got the text from the landlord some weeks back that I could have it if I want it, I had to make a decision on the spot. Normally, I would not agree to take a lease without feeling like I had the resources to make good on the commitment. However, in this instance, I felt like I had no choice but to throw caution to the wind and go for it. Perhaps this was foolhardy of me, but I just couldn't bear the sinking feeling that I'm giving up on a dream that is worth keeping alive. I owned a yoga center in Brooklyn, New York from 2007 to 2017. We had a good run, but eventually the forever rising rents made it unsustainable. It was a very special place. People chose to make it part of their lives and came together to share and be supported in friendship. And I so long for that again. After the center closed, I spent 3 years touring as a B-lister yoga teacher up until the world fell apart and decimated the yoga profession. With all the turmoil and destruction that has taken place, I resigned myself to the notion that intimate small yoga centers are a dying breed and essentially lost faith that such spaces for yoga are viable. Like many other teachers, I have managed to cultivate some vestige of my work online. I cherish the connections I'm able to make with friends who do not live in the same place as me. However, It is also impossible to deny that online exchange can never replace the importance of an in-person interaction and shared physical space. And then I got that call, and I said yes. So here I am, faced with what feels like an insurmountable challenge. Anyone who's ever attempted to create a yoga center knows that you need some amount of initial seed money to cover your overhead costs for the first year or so to even give it a chance at surviving. But I don't have any of it. I'm barely managing to make the mortgage and car payments, keep my 2 children fed and clothed. There simply is no extra money to do this. And having already reached out to anyone I know who might be in a position to help, I don't have anywhere else to turn except to whoever might be listening to this. I feel deeply uncomfortable. It's not like I have cancer or some horrible, life-threatening, dire situation that I'm in desperate need of help for. I'm just trying to open a stupid yoga center. How privileged of me to ask people to give me money for that. But truthfully, I don't know what else to do. And while there are certainly many more people in more need than me, I'm not going to let my own pride or insecurities stand in the way of doing something important. Because actually, I don't think it's stupid at all. With everything that has happened over the last few years that has made it seem futile to hope for anything, seeing if I can once again facilitate a space where yoga feels like it matters and people have an opportunity to come together, to breathe and move and discover in a spirit of awe and wonder and joy. It's perhaps the most important thing I know how to do. And the fact that this space showed up in the way that it has, it's so uncanny a happenstance that has compelled me to humble myself and admit that I can't do this alone. I have calculated my overhead costs for the first year and set that as a goal. This is the amount that I think will give the place its best chance to fly. If you are hearing this and have a few dollars to spare and you want to help me, I'm asking. Thank you in advance. P.S. Speaking of flying, I think I'm going to call it the Birdhouse Yoga Center. The name is inspired by observing house sparrows in my backyard. The center has a little side entrance, kind of like a hole that opens into a small little box that I'm hoping to make a nest in. Oof. So I sent that to my email list. And you see, I sent that a week ago, just like I did back in the day. My email list, I remember, started out with about 600 people. I'd say right now there's probably about 4,000 people on that list. And there's some percentage of them, some of those original 600 people are still on that list. And you know how I know that? Because since last week when I sent that out, 148 people have donated 65% of the goal. I really didn't know. I didn't really expect. I didn't even imagine what I thought would happen. I think I was prepared for it to not really be anything. I felt like I told God I would ask for help. And so I did. I asked for help from wherever I could think to ask for help from. And 65% is 7 months grace. 7 months grace I was given by 148 people who care enough to help me. And that has been really awesome. And I'm sharing it with you because a lot of you who listen to this maybe aren't on the email list. I don't know. And frankly, I haven't reached the full goal yet. And if you are someone who wants to help, I'm asking you to. And there's a link in the description if you want to do that. But really, frankly, at this point, I'm already feeling so blessed and just overwhelmed and grateful that I wanted to share that. I wanted to share that because I do feel like the dream's still a bit alive for me. I'm going to make this place. I went and met with the yoga center owner. He was so cool. He was like, you want me to take this wall out too? Like, he agreed to do this like renovations, and then we made the deal. And then afterwards we were in there, he agreed to do more than he originally agreed to. That never happens. So it's looking like it's possible. I'm really scared still though, because y'all know that the romance of opening a place doesn't always line up with the reality of if people are actually going to show up or not. And I don't know. I don't know in 2024 whether this neighborhood, enough people are going to want to come to support it and to survive. But we're going to find out. And I feel genuinely excited about that, which feels good to feel excited. And I really do owe this feeling to people out there, maybe people like you who, for whatever reason, care enough in your heart to help me. So if you're listening, if you're one of those people who donated, and I haven't already emailed you because I did email a lot of those people, thank you so much. And just, even if you're just listening to this, and you don't contribute anything to it, and you just listen, and somewhere in your heart, you're thinking, go Jay, I hope it works. Like, even if you're just giving me a little prayer and you're just giving me that like good intention and wish, that counts. We've talked about that on the show. I genuinely believe that, like, people in the world wanting it to work for me, I think helps it work. It helps me at least. And I think that helps it work. So thank you if you've taken the time to listen all the way through to this ramble of mine. And if you're thinking a good thought my way, I sincerely hope that other people out there are finding some way to have a feeling of inspiration, somewhere to put a little hope and find a little joy, because it seems a little bit in short supply, and we need to seize those moments when they present themselves. So I'm wishing that for everybody else. And that's it. That's it for this. I will be returning to our regularly scheduled programming next week. I've got a couple of fantastic episodes in the can. So thank you so much for listening. And what do you say? At the very least, we be kind. Let's be kind to ourselves. Let's be kind to others. And I will talk to you again soon. Please take care. Cheers.